Racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed that intro. I know I've been enjoying it lately. The first thing we want to talk about today is the Nordstream pipeline and the recent article from Seymour Hersh. And I see some people in the chat are already, surprised and asking it's been confirmed about Nordstream. Pretty much, about as much proof as we're going to get probably was just revealed from the famed journalist Seymour Hersh, one of the most famous investigative journalists in American history. Somebody who's been involved with the Watergate scandal, somebody who revealed the My Lai massacre of civilians committed by the U.S. military in Vietnam all the way back in the late 1960s. And, he's stayed relevant and prevalent in American journalism, even revealing the Abu Ghraib torture site in Iraq carried out by the U.S. military, which was used to gain justification for the invasion of Iraq. They would torture people and say, tell us that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. Tell us what we want to hear. And then, they would waterboard people or whatever until they told the U.S. what they wanted. And then those confessions gained through torture were used as the justification for a war that killed millions. So this was all revealed by Seymour Hersh, who now, a lot of mainstream media outlets are trying to dismiss as a conspiracy theorist who shouldn't be taken seriously, because he's revealed in this very well-sourced, very thorough and detailed piece that it was the U.S. military all along who blew up this pipeline. And, some people were patting us on the back and giving us credit for predicting this, because just a few days after the pipeline was sabotaged, we said clearly this isn't Russia, as the U.S. mainstream media was claiming. Why would Russia sabotage their own infrastructure that the U.S. State Department had promised to destroy, or said they wanted to destroy or shut down many times? It was in the U.S.'s interest to do this. It was not in Russia's interest to do this. So now we know there was an operation that was stationed in Norway that the U.S. planned for a while. A lot of the main players in this were Victoria Nuland, who you would expect, one of the main players in the 2014 Euromaidan U.S.-backed color revolution in Ukraine. I believe she was serving as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine at the time. And then you have Anthony Blinken, who is just, neoliberalism personified, the foreign policy arm of the Biden administration, who's done nothing except push for more sanctions, more war, more hostility, and more, finance, capital, hegemony, and dominance globally. So those were the major players who pushed for this. And, as I said on TikTok, for those of you who follow us on TikTok, or I think I've said it on the YouTube as well, there were a lot of people like Philip DeFranco, who has millions of followers and is, kind of the main news channel on TikTok, who were saying that this was Russia who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, and anybody saying that it was the U.S. is a conspiracy theorist or a Russian propagandist or a puppet of Putin. So now it's been proven, but how much damage have those people done, by shouting from the rooftops over and over and over again that it was Russia? This is probably the most widely viewed Substack piece I've ever seen here from Seymour Hersh, but there are going to be millions and millions of people who don't read this, and this piece is going to be suppressed by the mainstream media. So it's also our job to get it out there, though, and educate people on this. And shout out to Seymour Hersh for another amazing piece of investigative journalism.
And I just want to add that this plot to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline came well before the invasion. They were planning on how to disrupt the pipeline, because remember, the pipeline is one of the central sources of energy for Germany, which was being supplied by Russian gas, and one of the main sources of energy for large parts of Europe. So that's obviously not in the interest of American capital for those conditions to continue to exist. And so, since February 7th of last year, again, before Russia's special operation started in Ukraine, Biden said, quote, "If Russia invades, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it." This was a statement that caught the people that were involved in the operations completely off guard. They were like, this whole time we were planning this as a covert operation. We did everything we kind of needed to do to keep it a secret operation. And then here comes our president basically saying the obvious, which is that if Russia does what it was basically forced to do, then we're going to retaliate by making sure that the Nord Stream pipeline no longer exists, and that Russia can't use that as a chip in getting Europe to take less, take more of its side and less of the U.S. side in terms of how it reacts against Russia, maybe not sanctioning Russia because it knows that it depends on Russia for its gas. Victoria Nuland also said shortly after Biden said that she said, "I want to be very clear with you. If Russia invades Ukraine one way or another, Nord Stream 2 will not move forward." So again, the ruling class media, which all it really does is exist in order to set the stage for war, to play the drums that lead us into war. It's been formulating the narrative that from the start, this has been something that Russia did, which, why Russia would do something that's so clearly against its interest, it's never been able to answer. And then slowly with time, it's sort of left the answer of who did it kind of vague. But from the start, the U.S. officials themselves have basically said the obvious out loud, which is that they had the capacity to do it, and that if things ended up turning out how they ended up turning out, that they would end up doing it. So again, these are things that are coming out into the air and that are being proved. But really, if you've been looking at the development of the situation critically and comprehensively, as we have been doing here at the Midwestern Marx Institute, these are things that you knew were basically a fact, and that it's kind of crazy that, the things we were called, the accounts that we had banned because we were saying the truth. And, this is a similar thing that has happened to anti-war, anti-imperialist voices over and over and over again. One of my favorite sayings of Eddie's is that everyone's an anti-imperialist in hindsight. And we're going to see that once again here with Ukraine, and specifically with the issue of blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, where only now are the folks that have been calling us Putin apologists for our positions going to have to retract and say, well, maybe you were right, at least on this issue. So it's, again, I don't think that there's it plays an important part, but they're trying to reject Seymour Hersh's work. Wikipedia, not just the mainstream media, but Wikipedia, which we know has a bunch of money from the State Department behind it, has one of the first characterizations in Seymour Hersh's profile as a conspiracy theorist, which is absurd because the point of journalism should be to be a guard dog for the politicians, to catch them when they're lying and to be suspicious and be able to expose the truth to the people. That's what Seymour Hersh does. That's not what the U.S. media does. The U.S. media is a bunch of lapdogs of the ruling elite, and the lapdogs are calling the critical, the guard dog, the person that's actually functioning as a real journalist, they're calling him a conspiracy theorist. So it's a conspiracy theorist. So it's a completely topsy-turvy, upside-down world that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and I don't know if, Hirsch's pieces about Abu Ghraib or My Lai were published in the New York Times or whatever, but he used to work for some mainstream outlets, and now the mainstream media is such garbage, and such total utter propaganda and, nothing but parroting of State Department talking points that there's not even really a place for Seymour Hersh. Like maybe Tucker Carlson will let him come on and do a quick interview, but that'll be it. He won't be allowed on MSNBC. This won't be reported by the Washington Post, the New York Times, any of these media outlets that are owned by oligarchs or, worse, like military industrial complex think tanks when you're talking about outlets like the Atlantic Council. And like Carlos said, if you knew the historical context of the sabotage of the pipeline, this was an easy prediction. We knew the U.S. Did it. Economists like Jeffrey Sachs were saying from the day it happened, like this is obviously, a U.S. operation. Just by knowing, the different interests at play there, and the U.S.'s history of doing covert operations like this. And really, what sucks is that the people of Europe are the ones who get screwed by this, right? Because they were the ones getting natural gas, or they were the ones getting energy from this pipeline from Russia for pretty cheap. And now that's cut off, and there's this cost of living crisis in Europe where people can't heat their homes. All these different sectors of the economy are on strike. All these different groups of workers are on strike, including nurses and ambulance workers attached to the NHS. And then, Britain is cutting NHS funding so they can, create more weapons and send them to Ukraine at the behest of the U.S. and NATO. And Philip DeFranco, who I was mentioning earlier, one of the biggest news accounts on TikTok, just posted a video today saying that the U.S. was saying the U.K. now has a second-rate military. It's no longer a first-rate military. And, if you look behind the scenes, that's just the U.S. saying, don't cave to these strikes. Don't cave to the nurses and the workers in your country who want you to do something for them and spend money on them instead of, this U.S. proxy war in Ukraine. Don't listen to them. Keep cutting the NHS and boosting military spending and doing what NATO wants, rather than doing what's best for the interests of your people, which in West and even most of East Europe has largely been going along with this and largely going along with what NATO pressures them to do. And it's not ideal. We're kind of seeing the U.S. and all the forces, the pro-capitalist forces coalescing against the rising countries in the East, or the rise of multipolarity. But we have a super chat, Carlos, unless you have anything you want to interject right away.
Yeah, and just real quick, it's important to note where these journalists who have been able to break out the big stories like Seymour Hersh and Glenn Greenwald, where is it that they're writing? Are they writing for the New York Times, or they're writing for these massive liberal newspapers? Where are they writing? They're writing in Substack, and that's how bad the mainstream media has gotten, where any journalist worth a lick has to literally open their own Substack account or go into one of these, anti-imperialist, smaller and shadow banned news network in order to write their work. So I think part of the fact that the only place he probably was able to publish it was on a Substack is something meaningful, has something meaningful to say about the state of journalism in the U.S. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that perhaps the title is misleading. It's not just the U.S. The U.S. was the driving force, but Norway was a key player in this too, because Norway also has financial interests tied to blowing up the Nordstream pipeline, because the Norwegians, as Hersh mentioned, would be able to sell vastly more oil to Europe with that pipeline gone. And one of the key figures in terms of Norway that was involved in this, his name is Jens Stoltenberg. He was a supreme commander of NATO and a committed anti-communist for most of his life, and he served as Norway's prime minister for 8 years. And he was one of the key players that the U.S. used throughout these operations. But Again, I think something else that could be said was just, I guess, the messiness of these covert operations. It used to be the case that, the U.S. would do these covert things that obviously violated international law, and it would be able to at least be kept hidden for a few years. But the American ruling class is so decrepit. It's the state of American politics is so bad that even its covert operations are blurted out into the open before they could even be done. We've known that something like this was potentially going to happen. At least 6 months before it happened. So it's got something to say about the decrepit and moribund state of the U.S. empire as well.